I'll give a 20-minute presentation. One thing to keep in mind that, as Bruce mentioned, my background is I'm not a scientist, but what this presentation is looking at new areas where we to apply scientific research, such as done here at Bioversity. So after the presentation, I'd then like to have sort of questions and feedbacks and get your ideas and gauge your thoughts about it. Okay, so let's start. So the title of today is Improving the Status of Agricultural Biodiversity Through Private Sector Sustainable Sourcing. So here's the presentation outline. I'm going to give some background, set a few project parameters, quickly look at my methodology, how I conducted the review. Then from the review I'll explain my analysis and provide a mapping of the companies and the current trends. Then we'll get to the most interesting part, I think, for the audience. It's about agricultural biodiversity in this sustainable sourcing concept. And finally, some conclusions. All right, so first section. So sustainable sourcing, I think a good place to start, because everyone has different understandings, is a definition, and I'll read it out. It describes a sourcing exercise which goes beyond economic considerations and takes into account environmental, social, and ethical factors as well. And what this is, my first point is, my first project scope is sustainable sourcing. It's a broad term. It looks at the social, environmental, and economical. But for the project I have, given that I am looking at agriculture and the relationship to biodiversity, I have just looked at the environmental factors. Second term we need to define or set is the private sector, and what we mean by the private sector. In any industry it's extremely broad. Food and agriculture is no exception. Includes many different actors along the value chain who have responsibility in shaping our food system. Here's a little graphic I designed just to represent it. And see there's a whole range of the actors, from R&D, people who provide inputs, the farmers themselves, the people between the farmers and the manufacturers. But this brings me to my second project scope, and that is I've chosen to look at the manufacturers and retailers, and the justification for this that I believe is there's an increasing demand for the way companies manage their business. And I notice here throughout the presentation I've sort of put the hashtag, and that's sort of symbolic also to represent the way society is changing, the way we are becoming more interactive and connected, and companies can't hide the way they do business like they used to. So just to sort of give a little bit of an introduction about the current situation, if I can just put you through 2 minutes. This room is totally convinced by that video. I think we're all a bit savvier than that when they talk about sustainable agriculture. But why I wanted to show you that video is just to sort of demonstrate how sustainable agriculture is used, especially in this sustainable sourcing concept. And I'll, just wanted to sort of use that as an introduction. I'll bring up some issues I have with that video throughout the presentation. So my project, what were my objectives? Looking at the current situation, based on that, number one is to assess the current trends, sort of where it's all heading. Number two is to look at, okay, so this is the landscape, what are some possible entry points for improving the situation, given that we're talking about sustainability being here, there, and not really anywhere. And then third, it's great to do an analysis, but we need some practical recommendations to move forward. Okay, so I know what some of you might be thinking. You're thinking, okay, great, sustainable sourcing for the private sector, but how is that relevant to smallholder farmers in developing countries? But what the truth is that private sector companies in developing countries, they do interact with smallholder farmers. For example, here's that Pepsi interacts or sources its potatoes from, it says 24,000 potato farmers, most of them smallholders. Now the thing about that is you can sort of look into the conditions, but the point I wanted to make is that yes, the private sector is engaging with smallholder farmers, and what conditions there is an opportunity there through sustainable sourcing to hopefully improve the livelihoods of these smallholder farmers. Okay, so just quickly, my methodology. Basically set myself 5 research questions, wanting to know what were the strategies. So how did the company conceive them? Were they internal idea? Was it based on external benchmarks? Which ingredients? Because obviously companies had different sourcing requirements, but they also sourced hundreds of ingredients. Which ingredients were considered important enough for sustainability, and which others were just left that you can do whatever you want with the sourcing? What targets? What does the industry think sustainable agriculture should look like? How it's going to be implemented in terms of management systems and certifications, how to verify these claims. And finally, of course, understanding the motivations why business is getting involved in this concept. These are the companies I selected for the review. I've got the individual results. In the interest of time, I didn't present them. I'm just going to do an overview, look in this section. So the general trends, as I've mentioned, is that it's typically done per ingredient. And the companies, most of them, apart from Unilever, were using external references to determine sort of what is sustainable and how they can determine their policies and programs around that. No surprises that it's prioritized according to business interests. In terms of which ingredients are considered important for sustainability, it's all about volume. The other issue is if the ingredient happens to be in the consumer spotlight, so for example palm oil or cocoa. The targets are very ambitious, as you saw in the video. They were saying things like all agricultural products will be sustainable by 2020. They're well on the track to doing that, which makes me question sort of the validity of these metrics they're using for sustainability. In terms of implementation, mostly they're using external, getting together as an industry, using external platforms and partners such as SCI, which is the Sustainable Agricultural Initiative, and the SEDEX, which is another ethical sourcing platform where they can kind of group their resources together and have one assessment and verification of a supplier against their sustainability requirements. And most of the companies are referring to consumer demand and security of supply as the key reasons why they care about sustainable sourcing. So looking at sort of the overview mapping, I won't go through all of it, but just sort of two comparisons I can make. For example, if you look at Unilever here, who I mentioned, they've sort of really internalized it. They've come up with their own Unilever sustainable code, and they're really sort of going down to the technical issues. But if you compare this to Danone, who's sort of categorizing, at least I can see externally, in terms of sustainable agriculture about health, economy, social, and nature. I mean, maybe behind the surface there's more, but from what you can there's not a unification of how they tend to do this. They use different partners, different platforms, and yeah, so that's sort of how generally, from ingredient to ingredient, the industry looks. As I mentioned, though, they all have different requirements because they have different product lines. But I did take one specific ingredient, that's palm oil, because I thought it was fair to do one comparison point. So all the companies selected were members of the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil, and the extent that they published on their website was greatly related to their involvement. So Unilever has, I think, buys 3% of the world's palm oil supplies, and so they've really got a very well published strategy about how they're doing that. But compared to all the other ingredients, that the Roundtable did sort of create some standardization of sustainability requirements, goals, and measurement systems. And for example, we can see, I mean, compared to the other results they've got here, for example, their goal and implementation, they're all, I mean, we can go into the analysis of the RSPO and how effective it is, but at least getting people around the same table with some consensus of how to work together, I think is an interesting point to make. So my key points in terms of analysis is that there is a lack of coherency in terms of the metrics for sustainable agriculture in this concept. This has what I call the double-edged sword effect, where some companies really get involved with defining what the metrics, such as Unilever, and they sort of internalize the programs and management of it. And then there's other companies sort of like Danone that tend to be a bit more general and not using external references in terms of how they define the concept and manage it. From this, there's a variety of platforms, standards, and even sourcing tools that the companies use to make their decisions. This leads to this sort of choice editing effect, where it's quite easy to prioritize business interests around sustainable sourcing, but not to say that this is just a big greenwashing activity of the private sector. I think they are starting to realize it's a critical business issue in terms of managing risk, changing consumer, because of changing consumer preferences, security of supply, infinite resources, etc. And another key point I think about this sourcing concept is that group initiatives seem to be the way forward, and most attractive things for private sector companies to kind of piggyback on each other, to combine resources to achieve consensus. And again, no surprises that the concept is led by business, not so much by scientific research at the stage. Okay, so now for the most interesting part, I think, for everyone, is about agricultural biodiversity in sustainable sourcing. So just to recap, this concept of sustainable sourcing came from a demand, in increasing accountability and responsibility for how companies manage their resources and supply chain. So natural resources that we see that come to mind when you think of companies is, of course, water resources, land resources, energy resources, pollution. These are all what I call high-status issues. Consumers and investors, they demand that companies have policies and practices in place to, that they're managing sustainably these resources. But what I didn't find so much about is, unfortunately, agricultural biodiversity resources. And arguably, these are just as important in order to face climate change than water resources and land resources, etc. So just to summarize what I sort of, from my review, is that very low status biodiversity in food and agriculture companies, it tends to be only an off-farm issue, so what's around the farm, not on the farm. There are, however, some small cases with the concept of managing agricultural biodiversity resources. That was from Unilever in their Sustainable Agriculture Code. They say that crop and animal genetic diversity should be managed, demonstrate a wide use of varieties, etc. But there's still, if you go into detail, it's still only recommended as a should and not a must. So the big question is there a case for making the management of agricultural biodiversity resources a must and not a should in the private sector? So, and I believe there is, and sort of 3 points why. Let me just take a quick sip. The first point is about responsibility. So most of you will be familiar with this picture, basically representing the loss of agricultural resources that's currently happening. As Fowles noted, the two main reasons why we're losing this agricultural biodiversity is industrialization, globalization, marketing of the food systems. So the first point is, well, isn't it about time that there's a greater case made for taking responsibility, given that there are now mechanisms and concepts such as sustainable sourcing in place. The second point is related to risk management. So clearly with the issue of climate change, that the loss of agricultural resources means, we're losing options for the future, how to respond to climate change. So when you think about the food and agriculture industry, that losing this resource means that, or protecting this resource rather, it means that you're protecting your options to keep production in the future. And so again, another graph that we're kind of familiar with, and the question that I would take if I was making the case to industry is that if this is the pattern, isn't industry setting itself up to fail if we're relying, as we all know, on a handful of, such as rice, wheat and maize for our food production of our food systems. And the third point, which I would make, is about rewards. That is, what I've experienced in my internship and the conferences is that agricultural biodiversity is being understood, and it's issues with agricultural resiliency, with nutrition and health, with ecosystem services, and a whole range of issues that it's becoming basically a need to satisfy. And as with any sort of market where there's a need, that when that need is solved, that the party solving that need should be rewarded. So therefore, companies should expect to be rewarded. There has to be some incentive if we're going to change the food system. If companies are going to be a force for good for agricultural biodiversity, there needs to be some reward. So that could be in terms of political, policy and subsidies, or also, consumer support. But such incentives don't really exist. So, what you'd need to develop is these programs which connect this current development dialogue with future business practice. Okay, so my conclusions. The main entry points for improving the status of ABD in this sustainable sourcing concept would be, number one, that the indicators in these platforms, as I mentioned, there's this SEDEX platform where the industry gets together. Currently, I couldn't find any, being recognized that, about ABD. Another idea which I thought was good is that Unilever currently has the requirement from all its suppliers to have biodiversity action plans around the farm. Why not, for this concept, have some sort of management ABD resources on the farm? The possibility of some type of roundtable for the industry, getting research together in that roundtable to set the standards of how you would manage agricultural biodiversity. Greater need, obviously, for partnerships, connecting research organizations like us to set the standards so that when they talk about sustainable agriculture, that, it's really a valid picture of sustainability and not something conceived just by the business sector. And finally, I think there also is a role for advocacy, for taking the concept from from the scientific domain into the consumer domain. So just when you compared earlier to my example about Pepsi and just obviously supporting or interacting with smallholder farmers, I'm imagining a condition where they could set what potatoes they'd have to grow for their products. So just playing with the idea there. Of course, some limitations and challenge. As I mentioned, it's about the effectiveness of these group platforms. And for example, with sustainable palm oil, still only, every one of the major companies is on board, but only 11% of palm oil production is classified sustainable, and even 6%, even less, 6% of that is actually being bought. There's the issue of conflict between development goals. So you have we have companies supporting sustainable agriculture only to produce nutritionally poor products like chocolate bars and chips. And then there's the issue of taking, if we need consumer support for this, it's about obviously understanding the connection between agricultural biodiversity, resiliency, health and nutrition, and maybe my question if that's too complex for consumers to possibly understand and gain support. So in conclusion, I think there is a big opportunity to improve the status of agricultural biodiversity in sustainable sourcing concept, but there is a definite need for greater advocacy of the issue, to take the research from the scientific community to other sectors, and of course cross-sector dialogue and collaboration is required. There's my 3 R's, which I believe are the best leverage points. Talking about this stuff is about responsibility, risk management and rewards. And of course, it's always best, as Bruce said, to keep an open mind when working out these sustainability puzzles, in order to advance these issues. And this is just one very basic idea I came up with, is sort of the Action for Agriculture Biodiversity, or A4AB standard, and sort of over to you guys at the scientific community, is that possible? How would it look like? So that's it. Thank you for your attention. Companies that are responsible for these issues, and if it's not responsibility, then where are the reward incentives? This is a problem that we demonstrate in those graphs and those pictures of declining resources, yet we know the main causes, the drivers. So is okay, companies might not care, but let's develop some reasons that they will care. So,
well, what Bruce is saying is obviously the dilemma that we always face, where we have the private local benefits versus the short-term private local benefits versus global long-term public societal benefits, and always is that that's a big tension, and clearly that's one of their externalities, and that's what we are trying to create the mechanism. But something that I was thinking very important is that maybe if we are thinking about this agriculture biodiversity, is maybe more than saying now we're going to have palm oil, diverse palm oil in these plantations. That might not be the actual answer, because maybe palm oil, there are many issues with palm oil, but why not support it, since there are hotspots of diversity, and there are places. See, one of the mistakes we sometimes make is to think that we have to conserve diversity, agriculture biodiversity everywhere. There are hotspots of agriculture biodiversity. There are places where you have a lot of the diversity of the palm oil. For example, Benin, you go there and you see all these incredible, and the people are using that, and they're very poor people. So you could imagine, and they are maintaining all this diversity of palm oil, and they have traditional way. So if you can imagine that a way would be that somehow these companies, if you could connect these companies to programs that would support farmers in the areas of hot diversity, the hotspots of diversity, for example, in Benin, where there's a lot of diversity, and so that the people there can have a better life, but in a way that is compatible with maintaining these resources, these different varieties and types of livestock. That could be the way in which you are creating that connection. And in that sense, that also makes sense, because you say these resources of palm oil are going to be available for the future, since you have this diversity present, it would be available for the future. So in a nutshell, I think that if we are going to start thinking about these sustainability schemes, I really think we have to start really thinking that it's not going to be in the specific farms, but more about connecting these companies with hotspots of diversity, and finding out the mechanisms so that are in the matrix, as you said, that can create. Because again, the diversity is located in hotspots, and that's the diversity that is of relevance to society. And at the end of the day, it's society, is because we think that there's an importance not just to the company but to society that.
Exactly. I mean, you try and find something captured in that in one of these sustainable agricultural policies about the direction, and this is the exact type of thought and input that's needed to ensure that this concept is valid and actually has benefits for sustainability.
Thank you. You make me think in new ways. I think that.
Okay, good.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? Mary Margaret.
I just have a kind of going on what both Maurizio and Bruce have said. Where do you see biodiversity's role between this kind of the importance of, say, palm oil to a local community versus responsibility on a global scale, and how could biodiversity work as both an advocate for the small communities to the large companies, and as an advocate for the wider world population demanding sustainable resources?
Sure. I mean, by no means I'm suggesting that biodiversity would be in some type of commercial partnership or deal with these organizations, but I feel like this is the research that needs to be, because these companies will interact, as I mentioned, with these local communities, but there needs to be a scientific kind of bridge, but setting how these standards are set, and I find that biodiversity's role would be kind of that buffer between the sectors. So yeah, it would be a part of a partnership.
There are broader issues about corporate corporate social responsibility, which essentially question whether companies should be doing it at all. Companies are good at making and selling products, and why should they be investing their efforts in things that, environmental management, perhaps, that they're not so good at. If you want companies to take their externalities on board, then you should oblige them to do so, but you shouldn't be expecting them to do so out of the kindness of their heart. Anyway, that's sort of one argument about the whole corporate social responsibility aspect. But I think also, coming back to Mauricio's point, there are these trade-offs at the landscape scale that we need to consider. why we want to maintain diversity and the public good benefits associated with that, I think, don't necessarily imply that we need to have thousands and thousands of acres of diverse palm oil plantations. There must be some sort of safe minimum population which we consider is adequate so that these species are not at risk, so that they are providing public goods in terms of securing future option values and so on. And I would argue that those are relatively modest, there are relatively modest conservation goals associated with that. So one of the roles that biodiversity could play, for example, is in looking at the degree to which the concepts of biodiversity offsets, and you have this whole BBOP, Business for Biodiversity Offsets program, the degree to which something like that could be applied to agrobiodiversity.
Yeah. I mean, exactly these type of things. Again, it's sort of about the hotspots and the minimum populations you're saying are modest. All the information I was reading from the private sector, I didn't once any material or programs that came up like that. So the question is, where are these type of ideas in the dialogue of the concept? So
one of the things that we're looking at now is beginning to look at is sources of sustainable financing for agrobiodiversity conservation through sort of payment for ecosystem services, but applied to agrobiodiversity conservation. And things like agricultural input suppliers and mining companies and all these food retailers and so on would be prime targets for involving in such a dialogue, and really exploring the degree to which they're willing to offset their impacts.
And these things are the sourcing of sustainable raw materials, whatever it is not always CSR or corporate social responsibility. There's a value proposition associated with it. They're going at, not all of them, some of them are doing a greenwashing, whitewashing, whatever, but others are seeing this as a hard evidence, they would argue, that it's a financial proposition for doing so. They've done that. So it's not just a corporate social responsibility. They've moved away from that. That's got a sort of a negative aspect to it.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's one of the points which it's about. I think companies, the mature ones, and you're right, there are still some that haven't quite understood the idea, but the ones who have a mature approach of sustainability realize it's not just good for the environment, good for people, but it actually is good for business in terms of efficiencies, in terms of risk management. So I think, that idea that CSR, and you're right, there's that question, should CSR exist at all? Responsible business should be inherent in the core business model, and that's it. Companies should be responsible for their core activities. This whole that CSR should be an add-on, I think, is a debate you hear a lot. But I think a lot of companies are understanding to leave the CSR thing behind, and the way you do business, it's ingrained in the business model rather than an add-on. So.